So because you requested it, I figured we would go over a little bit of what we talked about in the very beginning of reading Augustine's Confessions in class. So today we opened up the text really for the first time. There's been a couple of days now where we've examined the Latin in Book 1, Chapter 1, but this is the first day that we really unlocked the whole book and kind of let ourselves run through it at a pretty brisk pace. First, we started with a brief overview of the Roman Empire, as well as its waning during the life of Augustine. We talked about how Augustine is probably writing Confessions sometime between 390 and 400 AD, thereabouts. And we're going to have one of the more conclusive dates of the fall of Rome being 410 AD. Like I said in class, there's a lot of different ways to measure the full collapse of Rome. And so you can hold these dates somewhat loosely, but know this is a pretty good measure. Know also that the collapse of Rome is an extremely complicated topic, one with a whole bunch of different theses running around as far as what caused its collapse. Some people saying that it was the introduction of Christian virtues or Christian focuses such as chastity and charity and almsgiving and all of these different things that Christianity would have introduced into the Roman Empire following Constantine's conversion, following the Edict of Milan, and finally, I think I just said Milan, but Milan, Edict of Milan. Following all of those comes the kind of explosion of the Roman Empire back into itself. It collapses, it implodes, if you will. And the fractals that end up coming out from there, the rubble, ultimately takes the world a bit by storm, right? In the inverse of the way that's sometimes meant. It has a fracturing process all around, especially continental Europe and northern Africa and the Mediterranean world. Augustine's writing just on the end of this. Towards the end of his life, he's writing City of God, where he identifies pretty much Rome, explicitly at some points, but sometimes implicitly. And he contrasts it with the kingdom of God, as is talked about in the four Gospels. And he ultimately wants to affirm that Christians are not primarily citizens of the kingdom of the world, i.e. that is Rome, but instead Christians of the kingdom of God. Now, Augustine is still writing at a time and in a place where there's a strong integration between the Christian world and the empire. And so it's worth keeping in mind that he's not writing at a time where there's as much blatant hostility towards Christianity, although it's hard to imagine that everything was completely held at bay. Certainly the Edict of Milan makes Christianity much more tolerable, and because of figures like Constantine really encouraged, there still is there's people in this world that you're living in at the same time too. And so it's certainly not considered just the status quo. And you can really see that when you start to dive into Confessions. Augustine begins his Confessions by basically turning in towards himself and turning out towards God with two words that we often don't see until Augustine pens them. One, I, and two, you. These are extraordinarily rare before the writings of Augustine, especially in the way that they're being used. They are brand new, honestly. No one before Augustine writes his Confessions is using the term I, that first person singular. No one is using it to talk about his or her own autobiography, his or her own life in that sense. And as we can also see, because he's willing to use I in that way, he's also willing to use you language in that way that really can only be likened to something like the psalmist. And I think it's no coincidence, indeed, that Augustine is constantly quoting the Psalms. It seems like that might be even where he kind of picks up the literature of the Confessions. He's writing from the perspective of the psalmist and then more or less continuing on an autobiographical work. And just a reiteration too, when we use the term autobiographical, we're just referring to a work that is written about one's own life, right? Auto being that Greek word for oneself, afto. And so when Augustine begins this writing process, the first couple of chapters of Book 1 really should kind of hit you in the face quickly, or hit you in the face starkly. You should try to put yourself in the position of one having not read anything quite like this before, seeing it integrated with all the Psalms and New Testament and Old Testament references that it is. It's chocked full of them. You could especially see that in the Oxford collections edition, but it's also true in the Penguin Classics. You'll see all the footnotes and everything too. It's just completely packed full of the Psalms. And as he opens it up, he begins talking about his infant life. He does this, interestingly enough. This comes back way later in the book in a section that we actually don't have a chance to read in this class, where Augustine talks quite a bit about memory. But he opens up basically saying that this is what I was told I was like, and I'm going to believe what I was told I was like because I've seen every other baby basically go through this. And he begins making the case that the heart, by default, is simultaneously only fulfilled in God, and that it is pushing and or maybe pulling, if you will, depending on which direction you want to take it, away from God. In other words, as the first paragraph memorably ends, our hearts are restless, our hearts are unquiet until they become quiet, until they become rested, until they rest in you. And then immediately he's going to launch into the fact that his heart starts by default away from God. This is extraordinarily intentional, as we'll get into, for why Augustine's going to do that. But we also picked up a lot of different ways that he begins drawing the questions out of the readers. Specifically, unlike someone like Plato, or if you're reading through Plato's work, you get to Socrates, there's leading questions in texts like that, where the author is framing an interesting question, but there's really only one way of answering the question. And if you follow the question carefully enough, you'll end up just going where the author, Socrates usually, wants you to go. Augustine doesn't write like that. He writes in a way that starts just shooting questions off from every which way, even questions that he will himself recognize to be nonsensical. Augustine is a traditional classical theist. He's going to affirm the simplicity of God, as we've been talking about in our other class. He's going to recognize that God creates out of nothing, and yet he's going to begin these chapters talking about how in the world could it be that you fill me and that you are in me because you have created me, and yet you come to fill me more. Is it possible that I have part of you now, but I will have part of you then? This part language is, in some sense, intentionally absurd. He's asking questions as a child asks questions and tries to grasp his head around the conundrum, which is God, the one that we are created for. And ultimately, this is going to just spring him forward on this continuous longing for the one that actually fills his heart to the fullest extent. So keep in mind, as he does that, he's not doing that simply because he's wanting to ask questions with leading answers. He's doing that, in part, I think, because he wants you to ask questions too. I've already started to lay the framework for pointing to how Augustine is going to use the privation thesis. That is, he's going to rely very, very heavily on the claim that evil is not a thing, and thereby God is not responsible for the creation of evil, because no one created evil, because evil is a lack of good, or is a lack of existence, and thereby a lack of God. Augustine's going to rely heavily on that, but he's going to do so in a lot of ways by pointing at the problems that come up on the way. You'll notice as he starts pointing to evil and saying, how can evil exist? God, if you created everything and you are good, how can it exist? As he's writing these first words, he knows the answer that he's ultimately going to come to a solution with, but he wants his reader to be drawn into the questions themselves. And that's a pretty good writing strategy. It's also just a very good devotional strategy as well. So keep that in mind as we continue to open the text, as we continue to look through the way that Augustine formulates his argument, and as we ultimately come to explore further his relationship between philosophy and theology more broadly, which will be a big theme, especially as we delve into books 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right. I will see you all tomorrow, and we'll continue reading this. I'll see if I do more of these summaries. I'll continue doing more of the Christian doctrine summaries, but I'll see if I do more of these medieval summaries, depending on how well they're received. Okay, see you then.